The defense has suggested that it was the defendant who yelled that at the time he was being attacked by Ron. The yell of surprise. During the defendant's 4 or 5 hours of testimony, did he ever say that he yelled, "What the F"? No, he never said that. Dominique Daniels, who was on the phone upstairs with his girlfriend, when he heard this, testified, didn't think it was his brother because his brother doesn't cuss. Thought it might have been Markeith, but he wasn't sure who said it. Dominique heard nothing else that happened outside because he was inside the house. He heard none of the other conversations that happened downstairs, outside. It would make more sense that this statement came from inside the house, from a place where Dominique could hear. Like the other bedroom upstairs where he was when he was talking to his girlfriend. You heard Stephanie Daniels say that she was on the phone with her mother, and she heard pow, pow, and she said, "What the heck? Clean it up." You heard Ron Daniels, the father, explain he was in the shower and heard what he thought were firecrackers, didn't think they were gunshots, and heard his wife yell, "What the F?" Evidence shows that statement was made by Stephanie, not Ron Daniels, or not. Remember, the defendant never said he made that statement. Mr. Lenneman indicated that state's hiding evidence. State didn't call Detective Savelli on this case. We didn't. He's right. We didn't. We didn't call Detective Savelli to tell you about the interviews that he did with people. We called those people to the stand and had them tell you for themselves. Mr. Lenneman indicated that, well, Detective Savelli, who I had a call, talked to Ron off the record when he was at the hospital, hooked up to machines and that kind of stuff, getting treatment for the gunshot wounds that he sustained. And that is some nefarious or evil motive that he talked to him off the record. The implication is that he told Ron exactly what to say in order to create this entire case to get Markeith Loyd. Is it reasonable to think that when they talked off the record, they might have walked up and said, "Hey, Ron, you got shot twice, or hooked up to a bunch of these machines. You feeling okay? You have any influence of any drugs or narcotics or something that would affect your ability to talk to me?"
Overruled. Reasonable inference.
Was there some underhanded motive for Detective Savelli asking Ron, "Did you attack the defendant?" Isn't a detective's obligation to look at all sides and look at all angles of a case to make sure that you get the right person? Absolutely, he asked Ron, "Hey, this is a possibility. Did you attack the defendant?" "No, I didn't attack the defendant," just like he told you in the stand. But there's some nefarious motive for asking Ron that question. The implication is that Detective Savelli had some unknown information from some other person. There's no evidence of that, ladies and gentlemen. What else did Detective Savelli talk about? Well, what was released to the media about some investigation into various people after the fact that helped the defendant evade capture, about how a judge placed a $500,000 bond on those people. Not Detective Savelli, a judge placed a bond on those people. We didn't call Detective Savelli to tell you about those things, because what do those things tell you about what happened at Long Peak Drive at around 9 o'clock in the evening on December 13th of 2016? Nothing. The state hid all these text messages from you. The state didn't present the text messages. Absolutely correct. What do those text messages tell you about why the defendant murdered Sade Dixon? Nothing. What do they tell you about who murdered Sade Dixon? Or what the circumstances were? Nothing. They talk about problems that they were having in their relationship. They talk about who cheated on who was lying to who. They don't show how these crimes occurred. Witnesses called by the state, evidence at the scene presented through witnesses called by the state, prove what happened that day. And 7 hours later, after these shootings occurred, after the killings occur and after the defendant flees, he does send a text. In that text, he comes up with the self-serving statement that Ron tried to grab the gun. But that text is even inconsistent with what he said in the stand. He never said Ron tried to grab the gun. That never came out of his mouth. Mr. Lemon, in his closing argument, has stood up here, he's walked up, he's pointed at Mr. Ridgway and I, he's stomped his feet, he's yelled, he's accused us of being unethical, of being underhanded, actually even accused us of being racist. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence that has been hidden in this case. The defendant knew about every piece of evidence. All these boxes over here contain the same evidence that the defense has. Nothing is hidden in this case. That's the laws of the state of Florida and how these cases proceed. What we have, the defense gets. There's nothing that has been hidden from anybody in this case. You've heard during the questioning of some of the witnesses referring to past depositions done. All these witnesses that are involved in the case get to be deposed and get asked any question whatsoever. Nothing has been hidden in this case. You heard from the defendant's expert for the phone analysis, John Sawicki from Tallahassee. How did John Sawicki get the information from the text messages from the phone? Well, he went over to Orange County Sheriff's Office and spoke with James Montgomery. Said, hey, need the phone. I want to look at it. What did James Montgomery do? He said, here's the phone. Do what you need to do with it, run whatever program you need on it, extract whatever data you want off of it. Does that sound like hiding evidence in the case? Of course not. These diagrams that I showed earlier in my closing argument, States 14. Were they prepared by me? Yes. And Ron Stewart explained to you they were prepared after the deposition that he gave where he drew this rough hand-drawn sketch that, yes, was introduced by the defense. Take a look at it. Look at it. Compare the diagrams. The diagrams are a little more professional looking and easier to show a jury to help Ron, to have Ron use to explain what happened in this case. Ron even told you that the diagrams were prepared and sent to him, and he was asked to look over them to make sure that they're accurate. Make whatever changes you feel are necessary. And he made some changes. That's how those diagrams got created. Those diagrams did not get created to send to him and say, you need to tailor your testimony to fit this story. Why would he make changes to make sure they're accurate to the diagrams and send them back? Ladies and gentlemen, the defense has indicated that the defendant acted in self-defense. That's the claim that Mr. Linneman has been presenting, and the defendant has claimed that all this happened because Ronald Stewart attacked the defendant, and there was a tussle, and Ron got shot accidentally. That's what is the catalyst for all this. At that point, the defendant has suggested to you that he realized that he no longer had Sade Dixon's gun, the 9mm, that he took from Sade long before Ron ever even came outside. And his claim is when he realized the gun was missing, he didn't know where it was, thought Sade may have gotten it, didn't see her get it, just kind of thought maybe. And he started to shoot and shoot and shoot, all out of fear for his own safety, to protect himself. And according to the defendant, he is the victim of this whole misunderstanding. Let's look at those claims a little more closely, ladies and gentlemen. Since the defendant indicated that this whole thing is Ron Stewart's fault, and that Ron Stewart wasn't telling the truth when he told you the sequence of events that happened that evening, let's look at how Ron Stewart's testimony is corroborated by physical evidence, body camera footage, other evidence in the case, and common sense. Again, Ron told you he looked outside through the garage window and saw that his sister was outside with the defendant. She was worried. She looked afraid. Ron goes out to try to initially figure out what's wrong, and then as things start to progress, to de-escalate this whole situation. He repeatedly makes statements such as, you need to separate, we need to save this for another day, Markeith, you leave, Sade, go in the house. He's trying to diffuse this entire situation and calm things down. He explained that Sade Dixon started to walk to the house, but the defendant wasn't having any of that. No, we're going to talk about this today. Ron is trying to end this situation. Told you, Sade runs to the house. He sees the defendant follow. He then runs to the door as well. And the defendant is standing in the front yard area, there on the porch by the door when the first shot rings out. Mr. Lenneman asked, well, why didn't Sade Dixon go inside his house? She didn't go in the house. He thought it was out there to be shot. You heard Ron tell you at one point there are bullets being fired, there are shots being fired, and Sade Dixon is kneeling over him trying to help him. That's what family does. Ron told you that before the first shot rang out, the defendant racked the gun, put around in that chamber, and prepared it to fire. Again, we talked that shows evidence of premeditation. And the defendant would have you believe at this point, well, not at this point, but earlier, while Ron is trying to do his best to de-escalate this situation, he's calm everything down, which the defendant on his own, on the stand, admitted that's what Ron was doing. That all of a sudden, Ron snapped, did a 180, and bum rushed the defendant. That he bum rushed a man who, Ron told you, is bigger than he is heavier than he is, he has information that the defendant has 2 guns on him, but the defendant wants you to believe that Ronald Stewart, the software engineer, bum rushed the defendant rather than tried to run with his sister to safety. That's unreasonable. And he was then apparently able to, after he bum rushes this bigger, stronger, older man, drags him from where the driveway is, where the defendant said this all happens, all the way over to the front yard area in front of the door. Ladies and gentlemen, that defies common sense and it defies logic. It defies every instinct a human being has to attack somebody that you know is armed, that is bigger, stronger, older than you. The instinct is to run, to get to safety, which is what he and his sister tried to do. And when he gets at the porch, he tells you, he presents himself as non-threatening, puts his hand up. Whoa, it's not this serious, bro. Still trying to de-escalate the situation like he'd been doing all along. The defendant isn't going to listen to this. He's going to end this confrontation on his own terms. Because remember, nah, she ain't going anywhere. We're going to talk about this now. States 3. Ron told you that the first shot came when the defendant was standing in the front yard area in the grass, aimed towards Ron Stewart, who was in the general area of the porch. He fired there, he fired another shot, and he continued then, the defendant, after the shot started, the defendant starts to walk around this pillar.
Yeah, sure.
Into the flower bed, onto the porch. Ladies and gentlemen, look where the casings are from the defendant's .40 caliber Smith & Wesson. You heard firearms analysts tell you that the defendant's firearm ejects to the right. Casings 3 and 4 are the defendant's casings. And if he's standing in this area firing this direction, would be ejected to the right. As he runs around this pillar, and he continues to fire, just like Ron said, what do we see at 11, 12, these other locations? Casings. Because they're ejecting to the right, like the firearm meant to do. And Ron told, what else did Ron tell you? He said he went in around this, over his body, and started shooting on the porch. Well, what do we see at these other areas? 14, 7, these other areas that are numbered behind the porch. What are those? Some are projectile fragments, some are casings being ejected to the right. Not all in this area. Ron Stewart explained happened. And these casings are landing in a flower bed and around a porch and on the side in the grassy area, not on concrete where they're going to bounce a distance, not in areas where they could be kicked around by people. They're wedged within rocks that you saw in the photographs introduced to States 3. What else did Ron tell you?
Richard, you done?
Yes, yes, sir. For now. Looking at photograph 5 from States 2, I believe, shows the locations of these various casings that we just talked about. And the photograph's a little bit better representation because the diagram is not to scale. It's a diagram to show the general location of certain things. Look at the photographs. The photographs show where these casings were, and the casings are in places that are consistent with what Ron told you happened. We also know from the body cam footage from Rachel Ward that when she approaches the house, where is Ron located? Where is Ron located? He's located on the front porch area. The body camera footage from Officer Rachel Ward's body camera shows when she walks up, you can see where Ron was located. You can see his head laying in that flower bed. You can see the upper part of his body on the edge of that porch into the flower bed, right where he told you he was. You also heard on the body camera footage, go back and listen to it if you'd like, about 2 or so minutes into it, you see Stephanie Daniels Dixon looking at her son. She says, he's shot in the back of the leg. He's shot in the back. We know he wasn't shot in the back. That's an exit wound from the gunshot that Ron told you entered his chest. Showing you photos 32 and 34 from State's Exhibit 2. These photos are taken right where Ronald Stewart's body is, as evidenced by the body camera footage of Officer Rachel Ward. And what do we see in this porch area? Right where underneath where his chest would have been, right underneath where the wound in his back is. There's a divot. In that divot you heard there is a projectile fragment. And what's in that divot? A whole bunch of blood. And what's in the flower bed to the right of that divot? A whole bunch of blood. The physical evidence is consistent with what Ron Stewart said. Ron Stewart also explained to you how the defendant, as he ran away, shot 2 shots from his car, from the area of his car towards the house. You can see the 2 shell casings in the center of the roadway, consistent with what Ron Stewart said. Ronald Stewart's testimony is consistent with the physical evidence, it's consistent with other evidence in the case, and it's consistent with common sense and logic. The defendant has given a very different version of events. Let's look at his testimony in a little more detail to show how it is inconsistent with a variety of other evidence and inconsistent with the physical evidence. It is his testimony that suggests that he killed Sade Dixon and her unborn child, and that he tried to kill Ron Stewart and several others because he was acting in self-defense. Ladies and gentlemen, based on his own testimony, he has attempted to blame everybody else for the bad things that have happened in his life. None of that is his fault. He blamed Stephanie Daniels Dixon for poisoning Sade's mind and because Stephanie didn't like him. He's blamed the police for him being convicted of this drug charge that sent him to prison. He blamed the officer in 1998 when he was convicted of battery on a law enforcement officer. Apparently blamed the jury was wrong when they heard the evidence and decided that he was guilty of that crime as well. He blamed the robbers for making him get the guns and carry the guns. He blamed Sade because she was a jealous liar. He blames Ron for attacking him. He blames the police because they issued a press release and were not fair. He blamed the media for making him out to be a person who killed Sade Dixon and her unborn child. Made him look bad. He flat out told you at the end of his cross-examination that he is the ultimate victim in this case. He's done nothing wrong. Let's look at his testimony a little bit. If you carefully look at his testimony and some of the text messages that were introduced by the defense, his words paint a very different picture. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about control. Throughout his testimony, you heard evidence of this controlling mentality. Glenn McCree testified, and he even told you that the defendant will get upset when Sade would not do what he wanted her to do, like not eat meat. If Sade didn't act the way he wanted her to, it upset him. This is a reoccurring theme. You heard he was with Jarquil Turner, his previous girlfriend. He wanted her to stop smoking, but she wouldn't, so she couldn't be with him. He first picks up Sade Dixon. She's wearing booty shorts, which he didn't approve of. She went to work as a bartender, and she was supposed to dress a little more provocatively as a bartender. The defendant said, "You're not doing that." She worked there one night and never went back. She went to real estate school, and the defendant's explanation was that she suspected him of cheating on her. So what he did is, so she didn't have to worry about this, he would take her to school and he would sit in the parking lot and sleep in his car so she could focus on what she was supposed to be doing at real estate school and not have to worry about where he was running around. Is that reasonable? Or is it more reasonable that the defendant was keeping tabs on her, making sure she was doing what he wanted her to do? The defendant told her didn't want her eating meat because that was the lifestyle he chose, and she should do what he says. When he discovered that she wasn't truthful with him about where she was, he told her he put his hand around her throat and pushed her down. That's a different picture that was painted by the defendant's statement and the defendant's testimony. But he cut his hair. We also saw some of this evidence of this controlling relationship in the text messages that were presented. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about whether the defendant and Sade Dixon had a good relationship. It's not about who cheated on who or who lied on who. Clearly there is some trust issues on each side of this relationship. It's seen all throughout the text messages. This is about what happened when the defendant decided to shoot over and over again at people at the Long Peak Drive address on December 13th of 2016. That's what this case is about. Look through those text messages. In none of them is there any indication that she's threatening to harm the defendant, that she's pulling a gun or threatening to hurt him in any way whatsoever. And the defendant spent quite a long time talking about these text messages, so I'd like to touch base on a few of those things. Obviously, there was a lack of trust on both sides. On December 10th, 3 days before this whole ordeal happened, this relationship was over. You heard the testimony from Stephanie Dixon Daniels, who said that on that day, she brought all of her stuff that was over at the defendant's house. She brought it all over, brought it back to Stephanie's house, and she had moved out, and she was now moving back in with her mother, Stephanie. And after this happens, look through the text messages, the defendant is calling Sade, and calling, and calling, and she won't answer. She won't respond to his texts. She's ignoring him. This is angering him, such that he sends a message after this relationship is over, 2 days later, and says, "Where are you and who are you with?" That's sent at, I believe, around 3 a.m., December 12th of 2016, the day before these crimes occurred. If the defendant is okay with this relationship being over like he presented on the stand, why does he care where she is and who she's with? He told you in the stand, jealousy doesn't live in me. Where are you at and who are you with? That's jealousy, ladies and gentlemen. He's not in control of what she's doing, and he's mad. He keeps testing her throughout the day on the 12th. She's not responding. He's texting her over and over and over again. You see it in the text. She's not responding. She's not taking this bait. He texts her again the night of December 12th and says, "I need to talk to you." Well, why? This relationship is over. He said it's over. She says it's over. Why does he need to talk to her? And he also told you this is the time where he's sleeping with his ex-girlfriend now. He sends her a text at about 8:30 the night of December 13th, shortly before all these crimes occur, saying he loves her and just wants to know where she stands. Well, it's clear where she stands. This relationship had been over for several days. Sade now knows where it stands because she logged onto his Facebook and found that he was lying to her, found that he was at a strip club, found that he was communicating with ex-girlfriends and things like that. So she sends a text to the defendant saying, basically, "I know you're lying, and this relationship is over." She ends it with, "F you, Keith." You can't get much more clear than that. She texts him, "I'm glad you had fun out to eat. Don't expect no baby." And that's the phrase that the defendant has grasped onto to explain why, in his mind, he goes over to Sade Dixon's house. He told you he thought she meant she was going to have an abortion. Well, clearly that could also mean that our relationship's over. You're not going to see this child when this child's born. There's no indication anywhere in this case, except for the defendant's testimony, that Sade Dixon was ever contemplating an abortion. The defendant told you, "Sade told me that her mother wanted this abortion to happen," or something to that effect. Stephanie Dixon Daniels told you that wasn't the case. And Sade Dixon is not here to tell you. And to show how concerned he was under this thought that you ain't going to see no baby or something like that, the next text that he sends back to her isn't, "Oh my gosh, what are you talking about? What are you going to do to the child?" It's, "I wasn't out to dinner." No mention of the baby. The next text after that, he talks about his phone being dead. Not, "Oh my gosh, please don't hurt the child," if that's what is going through his mind. It's, "I wasn't out to dinner and my phone was dead." If he's truly concerned that she is actually going to harm this baby like he wants to represent, those text messages following would be vastly different than what they are. So he tells you he goes over to Sade Dixon's house to talk to her and explain stuff to her and kind of smooth things over. He tells you, when he gets there, he tells you that he told Sade Dixon he was cheating on her. And he said he was going to give her another chance to be with him. There are several problems with that explanation, ladies and gentlemen. Clearly, the text messages previously show that this relationship is over. "F you, Keith, we're done." Why is he going over to Sade Dixon's house at 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night to try to fix a relationship that's over? That doesn't make sense. What makes sense is Sade Dixon sent him some pretty nasty texts, and he was upset, he was angry. The second part of the problem is the defendant decides to strap on 2 guns and go over there. And when you are assessing the credibility of the defendant and the defendant's version of events, you can consider that he is a convicted felon 4 times. The judge has instructed you or will instruct you on that, and that's in your packet. He straps these guns on and goes over to confront Sade Dixon. He's not going in delivering chicken. He's not going into a situation where he conceivably could be vulnerable, carrying money, and vulnerable to robbers. He's going over to see his ex-girlfriend to smooth things over. Why is he bringing 2 guns? He explains that once after she goes and gets the gun, they go to the rear part of the house, that she shows him the gun that she has, her 9mm. She pats it. She doesn't pull it. She doesn't point it at him. She doesn't threaten him with it. She pats it. And he says, "What are you going to do, shoot me?" He then pulls out both of his guns that he brought over there and points them at her. Again, he never told you that Sade Dixon threatened him with that gun. She pointed it at him, nothing like that. That gun is at this point a non-issue because she drops it. He tells her to drop it, and she obeys and throws it in the ground. Her having the gun at some point does not justify a claim of self-defense about something.
Rephrase.
Her having the gun at some point is not at all relevant to assessing whether the defendant acted in self-defense.
Overruled.
It's not relevant because her having the gun, he disarms her. He's in possession of that gun. Whatever happens after that is a different situation. He told you when she drops the gun, he pulls the trigger on his gun, and it didn't fire. Why didn't it fire? Maybe because there wasn't a round in the chamber, just like Ron Stewart told you. That's why he had to cock the gun and rack it when he was up in the porch before he shot Ron Stewart. Let's assess the situation at this point. The defendant is in possession of 3 guns. Sade Dixon is unarmed. She is no threat to him at any point, at this point at all. He has pulled 2 guns on her and pulled the trigger on one of them, which didn't fire. And he told Mr. Ridgway in cross-examination he pulled the trigger, he was intending to shoot her. Why is he staying there? Is it reasonable to think that in light of all that I just described has happened, that everything's going to be smoothed over, everything's going to be cool, we're just going to talk about this now? That's unreasonable. He chooses to stay. He could have gotten in his car and left. He chooses to stay even after Ron comes out and tells him to leave and tries to calm things down. Who is the one trying to calm this situation down? Not the guy that pulled the trigger on the gun earlier when he had both pointed at Sade Dixon. It's Ron, the software engineer, who's trying to calm things down and make sure everybody goes along their separate ways. That brings us to the ultimate question about what happened. Ron tells you he and Sade Dixon ran to the porch, the front door area. The defendant pursued. The defendant tells you Ron attacked him. Let's look at the reasonableness of these versions. Is it reasonable that after Ron makes, again, all these efforts to calm things down, that he snaps and just attacks the defendant? That's not reasonable. The defendant told you that the gun went off and it hit Ron. He didn't tell you anything about a struggle of the gun. The gun went off and it hit Ron. He also told you that he realized that he didn't have the 9mm anymore. He told you he didn't even know if Sade picked the gun up, much less that he saw her pick it up. Ron is already shot. He's out of commission on the front porch, bleeding from the wound in his leg. The defendant version is he just starts to shoot. He's in war mode. He starts to shoot and shoot wildly to protect himself. Yet in that wild panic, he's able to hit Sade Dixon 8 different times on her body. That's pretty good accuracy for a person who's in what he describes as war mode, panic mode, self-defense mode. Which brings us to perhaps the most important piece of evidence that proves the defendant's version of events could not have possibly happened the way he described. That's Exhibit 15.
Can I move?
Yeah.
The defendant made it very clear on direct examination. This is where he was when the first shot started. He also made it very clear on direct examination that all the shots that were fired came when he was standing in this area. Mr. Ridgway went back on cross-examination and said, "Are you sure about that? Tell me where you were when all these shots were fired." It's right here. He denied ever going onto the porch. He denied ever advancing upon the victims. Everything he said happened right here. States 3. We know that casings, when they're fired from his gun, eject to the right and rearward. If all the shots happened where he says they happened, all of these casings would be in the same general area as the other 2 casings. There is no way that casing, if he's shooting from this direction like he describes, towards the house, blindly, wildly, in a panic, there is no way that those casings are going to end up where where crime scene investigator Harrison finds them. They're not going to end up way over here in the flower bed. They're not going to end up behind the pillars. They're not going to end up on the porch. It's impossible. The casing does not eject right and rear, change direction, travel forward, go around the pillar, and land in the flower bed. Defies physics. It can't happen. The physical evidence completely refutes his version of events. Defense Exhibit 11, again, the text messages. After all this happens, he runs away. And he sends a text message at 9:24:26 p.m., shortly after this happens. What does this text message say? "Don't know if you gonna make it. Hope you don't. Told you don't play with me, and you went and got a gun on me instead of talking to me. So you wanted it when all I ever wanted was to talk. Now we paying the price." What did the defendant tell you about that text message? It was a typo. I didn't mean to say don't, I meant to say do. I guess he accidentally typed that N''T when he sent that text message. But ask yourself, is that credible in light of the rest of the text messages? When he says, "Don't know if you gonna make it, hope you don't. Told you don't play with me." Does the rest of that text message sound like he's really hoping that she's going to live, like he wants you to believe? No, the rest of that text message further demonstrates his need for control. "I told you don't play with me." He's justifying his actions. You got what you deserved. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about whose fault the relationship was. It's not about who lied to who or who cheated on who. It's about what happened at Long Peak Drive that evening. And what happened is the defendant committed 5 crimes. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted felony murder. to wrap this up, ladies and gentlemen, you also heard the defendant wanted to turn himself in after the shooting of Sade Dixon and the attempted murder of the other people we've been talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, from December 13th of 2016 to his arrest on January 17th of 2017, he had every opportunity to turn himself in if he wanted. His explanation is the media is to blame because they didn't report the whole story. The police are to blame because somehow they didn't reveal certain information which could have made him look better. And you heard that certain things weren't released to the police or to the media. That additional gun, Sade's 9mm gun, was not released to the media. And Detective Savelli explained to you why. They don't release all the information to the media because if someone comes in with information about the case, they want to be able to question that witness and make sure that witness actually knows the stuff the witness is saying and didn't just learn it on the media. That's why they withhold certain information from the media for that very purpose. It's done to maintain the integrity of the investigation. He doesn't call the media and say, hey, I'm going to turn myself in, bring the cameras, film this all so police don't kill me when I turn myself in. If he's concerned about Orange County Sheriff's Office or Orlando Police Department, he goes to Volusia County. He could have turned himself into Volusia County Police Department. An uninvolved agency has nothing whatsoever to do with this case. Told you he didn't go to his probation officer to turn himself in because he doesn't trust law enforcement. Well, this is the same probation officer the defendant told you he was smoking weed while on probation. He went to the probation officer and said, hey, I smoked weed. The probation officer cut him and take him to jail and violate him? No, he said, I'll give you a break, man. Don't do it again. On January 9th of 2017, he had the perfect opportunity to turn himself in if that was what he truly wanted to do. He's at Walmart. He's at a business with a lot of people inside, a lot of people around, surveillance cameras all over. He sees a law enforcement officer, Sergeant Clayton, just there buying groceries. He wants you to believe he wants to turn himself in, but what is he buying at Walmart? He's buying a bunch of water and food. That's not consistent with someone who's going to turn himself in. That's consistent with somebody who's going to hide out and lay low like he was doing at the house on Lescott Lane. Sergeant Clayton is informed by Takesha Bryant that the defendant...
Overruled.
Sergeant Clayton is informed by Takesha Bryant that the defendant is in the store and he's wanted for murder. Sergeant Clayton sees the defendant leaving the store and yells, according to Takesha Bryant, get in the ground. He doesn't get in the ground. Instead, he shoves the shopping cart, pulls out his gun. You heard at this point, based on the testimony of Takesha Bryant and Brian Stribbe, both Sergeant Clayton and the defendant had their guns drawn. And they're both drawn before any gunshots ring out. And then he does something that shows that he is not going to turn himself in. He fires his gun 8 times at Sergeant Clayton. We saw the 8 casings that were shown and introduced in evidence that matched the Smith & Wesson that was found on him at the time of his arrest. He was going to avoid being arrested and brought to trial at all costs, and that shows his consciousness of guilt. The defendant is willing to go through very extreme measures to avoid being arrested because
Overruled.
he's going through these extreme measures to avoid being arrested because he knows what he did to Sade Dixon, her unborn child, Ron Stewart, Dominique Daniels, and Stephanie Dixon Daniels was wrong. The defense has suggested to you that Sergeant Clayton got shot first. Smith view diagram states 16 casing A in front of the store, casing R in front of the store, casing O in front of the store are 40 caliber casings. Sergeant Clayton's casings are out in the parking lot area.
Mr. Lemon, you're standing in front of the
Judge, I have
jury.
an objection. It's a misrepresentation of the diagram.
Juries to rely on their own memory of the evidence. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Budsman.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Clayton's casings are out in the parking lot. The defendant's casings are the one closest by the store where the witness defendant wants you to believe he shot Ron Stewart multiple times in self-defense, one shot at point-blank range in the chest. He wants you to believe he shot Sade Dixon 8 times in self-defense. He wants you to believe he fired at Stephanie Dixon Daniels and Dominique Daniels in self-defense. The defense has implied that he fired at Sergeant Clayton in self-defense. In the video that was introduced by the defense, the last frame of the video is Sergeant Clayton running and him with his gun up. Is that self-defense? Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant has testified and wants you to believe that none of the choices that he has made in his life, none of the bad things, are his fault. He is the victim of every bad thing that's happened to him in his life. He told you that none of it was his fault or his responsibility. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the people at the Dixon household that were killed, seriously injured, or almost killed are his responsibility. All of the death and bloodshed in this case is his responsibility, is because of his choices, and is because of his decision to fire his gun over and over again. We ask that you hold him accountable for his actions and his choices. We ask you find him guilty of first-degree premeditated murder of Sade Dixon, the first-degree premeditated murder of our unborn child, the attempted first-degree murder of Ron Stewart, the attempted felony murder of Dominique Daniels, finally, the murder of Stephanie Dixon. We ask you that because if you look at the evidence and apply it to the law, the evidence has proven this case beyond any reasonable doubt. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Buxman.